morning, brethren and friends. The topic that I'll be sharing today is entitled, If God is Love, Why is There Pain and Suffering? If you spend some time looking around the world, you will find that people suffer because of wars. And we have wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East. People suffer because of the physical disabilities or permanent injuries that they suffer during the war. And many people are displaced and they lost their loved ones when the loved ones are being killed. And people suffer also because of famine and disease. And we see that in countries in the continent of Africa, many of those things that's happening there, the starvations and the famine. And people also suffer because of natural disaster due to earthquakes, tsunami, and typhoons. And millions of people suffer due to sickness and disease, whether they are nursing in the hospital or at home. And it has also been reported that there are 365 million believers in Christ suffer persecution on a daily basis. And most of these believers are in the countries where the governments are Islamic. So it's so much pain and suffering. This question, if God is love, why is there pain and suffering in the world? This question often pops up in the mind of both believers and non-believers. And especially for the non-believers, the atheists, they would like to use this question as an excuse to deny God's existence. In fact, to them, it is more than a question. It is a pronouncement of judgment against God. This question to them assumes that God is responsible for the pain and suffering in the world. The argument is that if God is love, if God do exist, it is impossible for him to allow pain and suffering in the world. But there's a problem to this argument. Because if an atheist who does not believe in the existence of God, how does he decide what is good and what is evil? What is his basis? What absolute authority will he be using? So from an atheist perspective, he cannot call God evil. He cannot say a man is immoral because he does not have the absolute standard by which he can judge someone. Therefore, he would be considered inconsistent. In fact, he has to borrow from the Christian worldview to use the word good and the word evil. So how about us believers? Many of us genuinely like to know if there are answers to this question. Thank God that God provides clear answers in the Bible. And I'd like to attempt to answer this question with 4 points. Firstly, to establish that God is love. Secondly, to know the origins of suffering and who is responsible for it. And thirdly, to discuss the 2 broad categories of suffering. And fourthly, if there's any value in suffering. So we know that God is love from 1 John chapter 1, verse 4 to 8. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. So we learn of this love of God right from the beginning in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. The first 2 chapters of Genesis tell us that God created everything. God created the light, the sky, the sea, the land, the stars, the moons, the sky, the birds, the animals, and of course human beings. The reality of man is the proof of God's love. God loved Adam and Eve and created them in His image. So in the beginning, Adam and Eve had a perfect relationship with each other and with God. Imagine this, Adam and Eve was able to walk and talk with God in the garden. There was no pain, no conflict, no suffering, only peace. In fact, the environment was so perfect then that they do not need any covering on their bare body. God gave Adam and Eve everything they needed. God provided food and water so that Adam and Eve can thrive. God gave Adam a job, and Adam found fulfillment in his job. So everything was perfect in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, God says, the Bible says that God saw all that He had made, and it was very good. So God's creation was meant to live and last forever. God's creation was free from sin, from pain, from suffering, and from death. So from Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, we learn very clearly that God is love, and humans, Adam and Eve, live peacefully with God and in harmony. So what happened? Why the world has become so broken, full of pain and suffering? It all started in the perfect garden of Eden. I do not know why the slides, because I'm using the Apple and I convert into the PowerPoint and I check it and somehow So it started in the Garden of Eden, and God, by grace, God gave man a law, all right? And in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, and He says, "From the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For the day that you eat from it, you shall surely die." So the forbidding nature of this law is actually the positive expressions of God's divine love. God loved Adam and Eve, created them in His image from the dust of the earth. He desired their love, their faith, their devotions, and their loyalty. So God's love is also in full display here, that He did not create human beings as robots, but as free moral agents, capable to love and to have faith and to make independent decisions and be accountable for them. So therefore, it necessitates a law as a means of an expression. So the continual presence of the forbidden tree allow Adam and Eve a means of displaying their fidelity towards God. Adam and Eve responding to God's grace on the basis of their faith as a manifestation of their love allows the continual blessings of grace. But this blessing of grace unfortunately stopped because of sin and rebellion. And we read of it in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. So the first recorded sin, God killed an animal to shed blood on their behalf so that God can put animal skin on their body. So we learned earlier that in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, God clearly spelled out the consequence of sin. The penalty of disobedience is death. So when we sin, and if we want to be saved, blood has to be shed. There is a cost to sin, and the price of sin is blood. So from Genesis chapter 3, we will learn that pain and suffering is the direct consequence of Adam and Eve's sin and no one else. From verse 8 to 10 of Genesis chapter 3, we learn the origins of shame and guilt. Shame and guilt, which is covered by the picture. The moment Adam and Eve ate of the forbidden fruit, they felt shame and they felt guilt. And because of their shame, they tried to find leaves to cover their bare body. Feeling guilt, they stopped talking to God and they actually hid away from God. So it's pretty much the same as us today when we sin. And sometimes we resort to lie to cover our shame. And we stop praying to God. And sometimes we stop attending worship in order to run away from Him. From verse 11 to verse 13, Genesis chapter 3, we learn of the origins of blame. Blame. So when God asked Adam in the garden if he had eaten from the tree of good and evil, the fruit, the forbidden fruit, instead of taking responsibility, Adam blamed Eve and even God for giving Eve to him. When God asked Eve the same question, Eve continued the blame game and blamed the serpent for the problem. How many families and how many marriages have we seen that has been broken due to finger pointing, blaming the other party for the problem and the breakdown in their relationship? And from verse 16, we learn the origin of physical pain. Physical pain. Genesis chapter 3, verse 16 is the verse that shows us what Eve has to face because of her sin. You see, Adam and Eve experienced no pain of any sort up to this point. But from that point onwards, pain has become part of human experience. And because of Eve's sin, women all over the world will have to experience pain in childbirth. Men and women alike all over the world will experience pain from their feet all the way to the head. We have ankle pain, we have knee pain, we have back pain, we have shoulder pain, we have elbow pain, and pain exists because of sin. And from Genesis chapter 3, verse 17 to 19, we will learn the origin of suffering, starvation, and death. We read earlier that God has provided everything for Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve do not even have to work. But because of Adam's sin, God has cursed the ground. And now Adam has to suffer just to eat. And because the ground has been cursed, filled with thorns and thistles, much part of the land has become barren, unable to produce sufficient food for the growing population, thereby leading to starvation. God's original design for man is for them to live forever. But because of Adam and Eve's sin, their lives would now end and their bodies would go back to the ground. And the primary means by which death occurs, namely pestilence and disease. And from Romans chapter 5, verse 12, it says, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all have sinned." Since the entrance of sin, disease and death has become part of human experience. And through death comes sorrow and grief. There were about 60 million deaths in the year 2023 around the world. Verse 23 to 24 of Genesis chapter 3, we learn of the origins of separation from God. Separation from God, spiritual death. Because of Adam and Eve's sin, they now no longer can live in the Garden of Eden. They'll be cast out from the garden and away from God's holy presence. That is the worst kind and worst consequence of sin. You see, God created Adam and Eve for himself, in his image, to reflect his character, to serve him, and to worship him, and to be near him. But because of their sin, they now therefore had to be cast out from God's presence and from Eden, from the Garden of Eden. It is the same with us today when we sin. We have to live apart from God, away from his holy presence, and we live without hope, and if we die in our sin, we'll be separated from God for rest of eternity. So you can see clearly Genesis chapter 3 tells us of Adam and Eve's sin is the root cause and the origin of shame, guilt, pain, blame, suffering, starvation, death, and spiritual death. God's perfect world was changed forever because of sin. Now the world has become so broken, full of pain and suffering because of sin. Broadly, there are two categories of sin. Firstly, suffering caused by humans, which we call moral evils. Suffering caused by nature, which we call natural evil or natural disaster. So because God's love, he created humans as free moral agents capable of making independent decisions. Choices will lead into either a positive or a negative consequence. The fact that people choose to disobey God and suffer the consequence of their sinful decision does not mean that God is unloving. For example, suffering caused by decision made by ourselves. We know that God died for us so that we can live. His blood has purchased our body. And we are to use our body to take good care of it for His glory. And the Bible is full of verses and teaching to tell us how to take care of our body, to avoid wine, avoid sexual immorality, to become a gluttony. Just because we choose to disobey God and live in those lifestyles and suffer the consequence of lung cancer, liver cancer, and sexual diseases, we cannot blame God and say that He is unloving. Suffering caused by decision made by others. For example, a government chooses to go to war. The people in the countries will inevitably suffer. A head of the family who is capable to work but choose not to work and choose to disobey the teaching in 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 8, the family will suffer. When husband and wife choose to divorce each other, the children will suffer. When a driver chooses to disobey the law, drink driving and speed and kill innocent life, the loved ones, the family members will suffer. So when people choose to make sinful decisions and suffer the consequence of it, we cannot blame God and say that God is unloving. The second category of suffering is suffering caused by nature. And because of Adam's sin, God has cursed the ground. And God also has sent the global flood during Noah's time because of man's sin. And the world has never been the same as God has intended. And also the world also is in a state of deterioration due to deforestation, industrialization, unethical agricultural practices, and consumerism, all leading to the imbalance of the ecosystem, leading water pollution and air pollution, resulting in affecting the human health and diseases and the environment. So when people suffer from earthquake, disease, typhoon, as a consequence of the fallen state in the fallen world, we therefore cannot blame God and say that He is unloving. Though we know that pain and suffering is the direct consequence of Adam and Eve's sin and disobedience, the Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that God will send someone in their future to destroy Satan and to save the world. This is a plan for Adam and Eve and give man a hope of reconciliation. So if a person suffer as a consequence of the sin of another person, and for reason that he does not know, what then can be the value of the suffering be to him? Remember the story of Job? He asked the why question, why does he suffer? God did not explicitly answer him. Instead, he posed him a series of questions recorded in Job chapter 38 to 41. And those questions highlight God's omnipotence and Job's limited understanding of the universe and the complex creation. Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 5 says, "Just as you do not know the path of wind, and how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you do not know the activity of God who makes everything." The main point of this verse is that under the sun, there are much that humans cannot comprehend, cannot grasp. We cannot make sense of the details of life. We cannot comprehend how the coherent whole comes together under the sovereignty of God. We cannot pinpoint why a person suffers because of the sin of other people, and why disease comes into his life and for what purpose that it has. You see, as humans, we are all participating in this broad complex of the fallen state of a human, of this humanity, which includes the tragedy of pain, suffering, disease, and death. But because of the hope that we have in Jesus, we can affirm that God is in control, and He is the God that we can trust. Jesus himself tells us in John chapter 16, verse 33, warning His disciples that they will suffer. But He assured them that they can find peace in Him because He has overcome the world. In James chapter 5, verse 11, the writer gave us two reasons why we can trust God. Firstly, God is compassionate. Psalm chapter 103, a believer suffering will elicit a compassionate and merciful response from our Heavenly Father. First Chronicles chapter 29, we know that everything belongs to God. Everything on earth and everything in heaven. And God is in control of it all. A lot of things may be out of our control, but it is never out of God's control. And that is why we can trust God. And the second reason we can trust God is that God rewards those who endure. In the same verse in 11, the Bible says, God, we count those blessed who endure. We know that God blessed Job, who has trusted him completely and has persevered his suffering all the way to the end. So you see clearly suffering has its values. Suffering helps us to bring our focus back to God. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3-4, we know that God is a God of comfort, God of mercies, and He's there to help us in our despair and in our affliction. And we also know that suffering helps us to see what really matters in our life. Apostle Paul has suffered much for the cause of Christ. And Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 3, verse 10 tells us what really matters in life. What really matters in life is to know Christ and to know the power of His resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in His suffering. You see, we are worshiping a God who have experienced extreme suffering on our behalf. He's a God who knows and understands suffering, and we can connect with Him. So therefore, the ultimate solution to pain and suffering is eternal life in heaven. And that is something that only Jesus Himself can give. Suffering also helps us to be reminded that this world is not our home. Our citizenship is in heaven. Philippians chapter 3, verse 20. What lies ahead of us is many times much more important, much more glorious than what we are suffering on earth. So you can see that suffering deepens our faith, it fortifies our patience and sanctifies our character so that we can be more like Christ. So in conclusion, we know that God is love. And from James chapter 1, verse 17, we know that every good things come from God. Every good things come from Him. So He's a source of health, happiness, and life. Not disease, not despair, and not death. The world that God has desired and devised for man is in the world found in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. But the world, that beautiful and perfect world, has come to a tragic end because of sin and rebellions that we read in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. So from that moment to this present hour, sin has been hovering over the earth, producing misery, troubles, pain, suffering, disease, from birth to grave. So if you ask this question, if God is love, why is there pain and suffering in the world? Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3 provides the answer. So if there's anyone among us who have been studying the Bible and like to take this opportunity to become a Christian and to obey the gospel, or if there's any brethren among us who like to request for a prayer from the church, please come as we stand and sing the song of invitation.
Thanks for listening.